Alright, YouTube, for those who do not realize it, the Syrian migrant crisis in Europe is a prelude to war in Syria. We've had two of these before, both of which failed. You'll remember, of course, over a year ago, DC and the government of the UK and kind of the French, although not really wanted to go in and destroy Assad. Now, the first, before even that happened, of course, the Western world decided it was a good idea to destroy Assad, and so they took some of these Islamo-fascist groups in Syria and gave them lots of money and weapons and some training, and probably sent people in covertly to help them along. Um, Probably some militants from Iraq as well to get things rolling, to start a civil war, of course, in Syria. Now, the basic principle behind it is that of Greater Israel. I think that it's fairly clear if you look at which nations are being destabilized, who has a vested interest in them being unstable in the first place. There are only two different nations in the region that really derive any benefit from what's currently going on, especially in Mesopotamia, and went on before in Egypt as well as Libya. And those are the Saudi Arabians and the Israelis. Of course, these hegemonic powers there that control these oil pipelines really don't want them in the hands of governments that will try to remain sovereign and think for themselves, governments that haven't fallen in line with the sort of Saudi coalition, which is also friendly towards Western interests, kind of. Now, I look at it as a form of treason almost when the Western governments are trying to meddle in the Middle East, because there's no guarantee there that the Saudi led coalition that exists there is going to remain on the side of the Western world. What the fuck is the point of propping them up and making them all powerful within the region, only to see them perhaps in the future say, oh, well, now we're going to screw the Western world as well? It's clear that what OPEC is currently doing with regards to the oil prices, not attempting to cause them to rise at all, yes, it's screwing the Russians, yes, it's screwing China, yes, it's even screwing OPEC itself, but it's also an attempt to screw U.S. oil firms. It's fairly clear that this is why this happened in the first place. You look at U.S. oil, it's now rising dramatically. The idea, I guess, is to slow down U.S. production enough and to hopefully, put the kibosh to their oil exploration by keeping the price of oil cheap enough where it's no longer profitable unless it's led by government interventionism. And Obama's, of course, willing to do so. He's opening up these lands and helping these companies do so, which is one of the better things he's done while in office. Most people on the left don't realize Obama's attacks on coal caused an oil boom in this country and a natural gas boom. They think that it's, oh, green energy, environmentalism. Sorry, folks. Hate to burst your bubble, but this was probably designed by a bunch of oil corporations that really wanted an oil and gas boom in this country. And it's worked out. I mean, it's fine for our economy. It's done well. But these people, if they knew the real reasoning behind the attacks on coal, they wouldn't support them, ironically enough. They would say, oh, we're just trading one fossil fuel for another. Back to the Syrian crisis, though. First, you had attempts generally to destabilize Syria. Assad, of course, was then left with two choices. He either watches his country completely collapse and get taken over by the same Islamo-fascists that hold large chunks of Iraq, or he fights back. The second that he began fighting back, the West immediately cast him as a brutal dictator who was waging a war on popular resistance that represented a legitimate governing authority in Syria. That he was a dictator, brutalizing his own people, repeatedly purging them. Even though under Assad, the Druze and the Christians and the Jews and the Alawite minority and all of these different groups had been protected by Assad and his military for decades. We're talking about a nation in which groups that elsewhere in the Middle East are generally killed, or at the very least open hostility is lodged against them and there's no recourse against that hostility. You would think of Saudi Arabia. If you happen not to be a Sunni Islamist in Saudi Arabia and you get harassed by a Sunni Islamist, there's no legal recourse for you. Nobody's going to help you. You either leave or you deal with being abused and eventually probably killed. In Syria, it wasn't that way. These minorities were protected for the most part. It's like in Iran. Iran has been the same way, oddly enough. Everyone talks about how terrible Iran is. But the Iranians, there's a Jewish minority in Iran. There are Zoroastrians still that live in Iran. There are also Zoroastrians in Pakistan. They're a dying breed. There are all sorts of these groups in Iran, and as long as they're not proselytizing, as long as they're from Iran itself, nobody there appears to really care. And make no mistake, war with Iran is on the table as soon as a war with Syria begins, and would likely happen at the same time, because the Iranians may very likely get involved because they realize that they're next. And then, of course, the same propaganda will be used against them. So, the Western countries, post-destabilization of Syria, and by Western, I mean Western interests that are controlled by AIPAC, of course. They destabilize it. They try to cast Assad as a butcherous murderer. People aren't having any of it because they remember Iraq, they remember Afghanistan. They look around the Middle East, say, our involvement there has been a disaster in Libya. It was almost a disaster in Egypt. It's certainly been a disaster for the Iraqis. And they said, well, we want to stay out of it. So the government sort of backs off, says, okay, we won't get directly involved in Syria. Then they said, oh, well, Assad's gassing his own people. Look at all these tens of thousands of nerve gas victims. Now, unmedicated individuals realized there was no evidence that Assad was the one using such weapons. Many people still think, oh, it was probably ISIS. Maybe even the so-called moderate rebels that we ourselves funded. In fact, where was that gas manufactured? Could it have been shipped across the Turkish or Saudi border? With Iraq, of course, and then shipped into Syria to use as a false flag measure against Bashar al-Assad? Possibly, and because people realized that there was no actual evidence Assad had conducted the nerve gassings, they said, well, you know, where's your evidence? We want to see evidence first. And the government said, well, we want to conduct targeted strikes on Assad's forces, which would be an act of war. He's still the sovereign leader of the sovereign nation, regardless of whether the Western world likes it or not. He's still the one who happens to hold sway over half of Syria, the other half being devolved into absolute chaos. There's still a functioning slice of Syria where he happens to exist. He's backed by the Russians. He's backed by the Iranians. They said, well, he gassed his people. There was no evidence. People largely came out against the idea of targeted strikes here in the U.S. Obama backed off and went silent about it for about a month, remember? That was many months ago. The UK, David Cameron wanted to get involved. Oh, well, we need to do something about this mess. The House of Commons struck him down. They said, nope, no war. No, you're not going to conduct airstrikes. No, you're not going to conduct targeted strikes. No, you're not going to drop troops in Syria. I think they probably realized it would be a bloodbath if they did. So then these Western governments backed off again. Now we're in the next wave. What's the new plan? The new plan is to show you propagandist images of a bunch of dead little children who would still be alive, by the way, if we hadn't destabilized Syria in the fucking first place, because we were the ones largely arming these rebels and thought that was some sort of great idea. We did the same thing in Afghanistan against the Soviets. Oh, how well that worked out. Look at what a shining example of a Western democracy Afghanistan is today. Look at how stable Iraq is. Look at how great Libya is. Look at what the shining golden utopia Egypt almost turned into under the Muslim Brotherhood that Obama just loved to death. And people, I think, see through that slightly, but these images that you're getting, these tear-jerking, sort of ultra-emotional images of dead children sitting by the beachside are propaganda. Those are propaganda images, folks. Yes, people are dying trying to get into Europe. Why are they trying to get into Europe? What they neglect to tell you is that it was our intervention in Syria in the first place largely responsible for this. All we had to do was stop intervening. Assad would have wiped the floor with the rebels, fended off ISIS, hopefully, and it would have returned to relative stability. You would not have had the migrant crisis that you have in Europe right now. Millions of people have fled Syria and Iraq. There are over 1 million of them still residing in Turkey, wondering where they're going to go. The Kurds are involved. The Kurds are killing everything in their path because they want to form Kurdistan. You think that they're not raising villagers? You think that they're not firing on civilians in these areas that they want for themselves? Of course they are. They do it in Turkey all the time. The Kurds have been doing that in Turkey for a long, long time. They're considered a terrorist group. And yet somehow, here's the funny part. Our government, if you try to go over and join ISIS, you're probably going to get sent to a prison. But if you go over to help fight with the Kurds, alongside the Kurds, even though you're largely going to be fighting for Kurdistan and not against ISIS, unless ISIS happens to be the people in front of you that you're shooting at the time, then oh, that's fine, even though they're a recognized terrorist group that are backed by all of these Islamists that really hate the Turks too, which are a member of NATO. Oh, there's no conflict of interest here, folks. You see, the problem is this. Our intervention fucked Iraq. And now people are resisting calls to go back into Iraq. They're saying, what the hell is the point? We intervened there. We were there for a decade. Look how shitty it is. Look at what happened to Libya. Look at what happened to Afghanistan, to Egypt almost. Look at what happens in these countries where we get involved. But here's the thing. The destabilization is the point. They want Syria to be unstable. By the way, these refugees, the Europeans are now currently fracturing upon ideological lines. The Eastern Europeans, who realize what it's like to have segments of your native population purged by a foreign power, are resisting calls to take refugees. They know better. They know what it's like when tens or hundreds of thousands of foreigners that do not respect your culture show up all of a sudden. They know what it's like because they underwent it when they were part of the Soviet Union sphere. They understand what it feels like to be purged. They understand what it feels like to be invaded. When's the last time that this happened to the Western Europeans? It never did. Germany is currently raising the rallying cry and threatening to close off free movement to countries which don't take their share of migrants? The Germans of all people? I mean, yeah, if you want to take hundreds of thousands of refugees, that's just great. You go ahead and destroy your own culture because that's exactly what the point is. The point is to weaken Europe and destabilize the Middle East, probably to destabilize the United States eventually, and form this greater Zion that is what exactly all of these individuals who were in the founding of Israel in the first place wanted. And the Saudis get something too. They'll probably gobble up half of Iraq. They won't give a shit. They've got plenty of oil sales. They just want to keep the oil flowing. As long as they maintain relative control over the oil-producing nations in the region, and as long as they have their oil flowing so they can get rich, they don't give a fuck. But the European countries that are currently saying, oh yeah, we'll take a few tens or hundreds of thousands of these refugees, you're doing exactly the wrong thing. What you're going to do is encourage other people to migrate. Those over 1 million refugees in Turkey are going to come into Europe now. They're not going to stay in Turkey. You know, where they'll be treated like asylum seekers. They will be in refugee camps, living on a base subsistence sort of system. They're going to go where the welfare is good, because why the hell wouldn't you? I know I would. Any reasonable person would. If they can choose between getting their half loaf of bread and a cup of water and a cot to sleep in, and going to a really rich Western European nation where they can stuff themselves with chocolate pudding on the taxpayer dole, they're going to choose the latter. They're not going to stay in Turkey. They're not going to stay in Greece and Macedonia. The only ones that are still there are the ones that haven't yet made the journey. They're all going to go to Germany and the UK and France and Sweden and the Netherlands and places like this. And these nations have the gall to try to tell the Eastern Europeans, oh, you have to take migrants. Even though your people have spoken up and said, we don't want refugees here. You know, we don't care. We're not responsible for this situation. And they're not. How the hell are the Polish or the Slovakians or the Hungarians or the Czech or any of these groups? How are the Finns? How are they responsible for the situation in Syria? They've done absolutely nothing wrong. They are not responsible for taking refugees. The refugees would not exist if the West hadn't intervened. Yes, I'm fully aware of the fact that Syria is a pawn of the Russians. Well, actually, it's sort of a pawn of Iran, which is a pawn of the Russians. It's the pawn of a pawn. Okay, I get that. I understand that. I understand that the Iranians are essentially an ally and a pawn of this former Soviet post-empire Russia led by an insane quasi-communist warmonger named Putin. I understand this fact. I'm not ignorant to that, and I'm no supporter of Russian interests. For all I care, Russia can collapse and balkanize, and I think the world would be better off for it. And your Eastern Europeans that don't want to take the refugees would probably agree, oddly enough. But here's the thing. Just because a nation happens to be aligned with the Russians doesn't mean that the situation gets magically better and you benefit from destabilizing them and undergoing some sort of regime change. We did that in Libya. Did it work out well? Or did it destabilize a nation that had held back migrant swarms from entering Europe for decades? Oh, that's right, the latter. You know, the economic damage that's being done in Europe right now has far outweighed any benefit from ousting somebody like Gaddafi. Yeah, totalitarian Gaddafi, we understand. But Libya was relatively wealthy and stable at the time. The average Libyan was doing pretty damn well, certainly by African standards, almost by European standards, under Gaddafi. The fact that he happened to be a bit of a warmonger and kind of a socialist and allied loosely with the Russians and wanted to start his own sort of weird currency deal, shouldn't mean anything. What benefit did we derive from destabilizing them? I'll tell you exactly what'll happen if we oust Assad. The same thing will happen in Syria that happened in Libya. With Syria and Iraq both destabilized, where will these refugees go? Let's see. How many have the Saudis taken? 0. How many have the Israelis taken? 0. The opposition parties in Israel spoke up a couple days ago, said we should take some of these refugees. Netanyahu said, no, we don't want any of the refugees here. We want to preserve our pure race, our master-chosen bloodline. How many refugees are being taken by Kuwait? How many refugees by Bahrain? Or the UAE? How many refugees are they taking? Some of them went to Jordan. The Jordanians are willing to take them. They have no problem. But the problem is the Jordanians can't take anymore. They got one little, almost completely landlocked little tiny fucking country. They've already got several 100,000 refugees there. They can barely afford to keep them there as is. But they'll keep them safe as long as they can. Of course, Jordan will eventually get destabilized probably too. Because eventually, the Israelis and the Saudis and the Western governments will get together with their AIPAC means, say, oh, well, you know, I know how we can cast this and get rid of Jordan so that other people can absorb that land. Oh, it's a monarchy. Well, we don't want monarchies in the Middle East. Just ignore the existence of the House of Saud, by the way. We don't want clerics, but just ignore all the madrasas that are built by the Saudi Arabians all over Europe and the United States. Ignore those. Saudi Arabia is supposedly our ally, so nobody gives a fuck. Nope. The refugee swarms are being invited into European countries so that the Europeans will be under so much stress because of the migrants draining their economy and rioting in the streets, as they're doing in Greece and Hungary and Macedonia right now, and as they've probably done in Turkey. You're not going to hear much from the Turkish media because it's muzzled by fucking Erdogan. As they've done in Spain, as they've done in Italy, as they've been doing in France, Germany, Sweden, and the UK for some time. It happened a couple summers ago, I think. There were thousands of rioters in the streets of Stockholm. Police just sat by and did nothing. They were burning things, throwing rocks. They didn't do anything. Nobody got jailed for that. People get raped all the time in Sweden by these so-called refugees from Africa and the Middle East. Nobody does a damn thing about it. In fact, they practically advertise, go to Scandinavia and you can rape people and it's perfectly okay in these home countries. The European governments are simply attempting to start a war. The only way to do that is to get popular support for a war. How do you do that? You put your own people under enough stress. So they'll say, we gotta do something about Syria because we can't take any more fucking migrants. Okay, we'll get involved. It won't actually stop the civil war. It'll just lead to even more destabilization. But that's how they will get the go-ahead to actually go in and kill Assad. They won't let him speak before he dies. They'll kill him in an Osama-ish way. Not in a Saddam way where he gets a trial. He'll be shot, supposedly by his own people, which means, of course, a sniper will kill him and then his corpse will get dragged through the street while being sodomized like Gaddafi's was. You didn't get to hear much from Gaddafi now, did you? When the totally spontaneous uprising happened there, you didn't hear anything from Gaddafi. He didn't get a trial. He just got sodomized with a stick in the street and beaten and burned and killed. That's exactly what'll happen to Assad. You know, I do feel sorry for those fleeing Syria. But I don't feel sorry for them because of anything Assad really did, because by all accounts, the government he was managing, while authoritarian, was at least stable. People weren't, you know, starving in the streets by the millions and getting raped by ISIS members while Assad was in power over his entire sovereign chunk of land. I feel sorry for them because the Western governments have been duped by a bunch of Zionists which have convinced them that somehow it's a good idea to destabilize Syria because it'll end up just like fucking Iraq. And for decades to come, it'll be utterly unstable. Eventually, you will have an Islamic Caliph state. You probably will. Who the hell's gonna stop them? We can't stay in the Middle East forever. We tried that in Iraq, it didn't work. Eventually, people get tired of it, they force withdrawal, and then things fall apart again. Are we gonna keep going into these countries over and over every decade or so to restore order over and over again, only to then leave and watch it unfurl? You know, and collapse? Is that what we're going to do? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So you should ignore these images. I understand fully well how sobering the images coming out of the Mediterranean are when people drown and their bloated bodies wash up on shore. Yeah, it's a fucking tragedy. Who's ultimately responsible for that? Did Assad actually gas his own people? Probably not. Has he actually attacked civilian centers that weren't already overrun by terrorists? Apparently not. Are the Iranians responsible? Who's responsible? Who destabilized Syria? A bunch of Islamo-fascist so-called moderate rebels funded and trained by the West. There's your problem. We tried the same thing in fucking Afghanistan. It did not work. You know, the government here and the governments in Europe need to understand this. We've already tried this strategy to sort of destroy one of Russia's states that it had in its sphere. With Afghanistan, it was a state that it wanted in its sphere, and we managed to fight them off. They suffered catastrophic losses, by the way. But then Afghanistan fell into the hands of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Oh, well, you know, long term, did we really have a victory there? Was it sort of a neutral situation with a hell of a lot of death on all sides? Probably the latter. So I will perpetually oppose any action in Syria. We shouldn't even be conducting airstrikes unless they're specifically against ISIS. The problem is, do you trust our government to actually just target ISIS and not accidentally hit a couple of Assad's tanks? You actually trust them? The fucking department, the fucking Pentagon, is still trying to inject more Western-trained, Western-backed, Western-funded, Western-supplied rebel fighters in there. They're not fighting ISIS. They're terrified of ISIS. They're going off to kill Assad's men. They're not worried about ISIS, neither are the Kurds. The only time they attack them at all is when they happen to be standing in the way of the line of fire for them to go kill somebody else. They practically, on a philosophical basis, the so-called moderate rebels in Syria ideologically agree with ISIS. The only difference is they want Syria under their Islamo-fascist rulership rather than ISIS sort of pan-Islamo-fascist movement. That is, ISIS wants to amalgamate all of these states and make one caliph state. The Syrian resistance wants one Islamo-fascist but still sovereign entity. And so when you see millions of migrants entering Europe, the Europeans are letting them in specifically to try to get the Europeans to support a war to restore order in Syria. It's the only purpose. They wouldn't be showing you images of drowned little kids if they didn't want to go in, and when they do, it won't be to attack ISIS. They're not going to blame ISIS. They may fire a few rounds at ISIS. They're going to back the Syrian so-called moderate rebels, and they're going to attack Assad. They're going to oust him. Unfortunately, that means that Syria will be perpetually destabilized. ISIS probably will take over. Now, yeah, ISIS is no friend of the Russians. You think they're a friend of the Western world? And a lot of people say, oh, the USA funds and controls ISIS. No, we funded and controlled militant groups that then migrated into ISIS. There's a little bit of a difference there. We are fighting ISIS. The problem is it's gotten out of hand now, and it's not clear we can actually get rid of them. They're absorbing Al-Qaeda. Al-Shabaab pledges loyalty to ISIS now. Why? Because they're the most effective fighters. They're so insane, so absolutely butcherous, everyone in the region's terrified to fight them. The Kurds don't give a shit about ISIS. If ISIS isn't actually trying to attack them or happening to occupy an area of what they hope will become Kurdistan, they're going to leave ISIS alone. As far as they're concerned, as long as ISIS is fighting primarily Assad or these moderate groups that are still under Western control, the Kurds don't give a shit about them. People go over, they've said, if you join the Kurdish resistance, you're not fighting against ISIS, you're fighting for Kurdistan. Well, that's exactly the truth, and the Europeans seem to support that idea. See, Kurdistan wants a chunk of land that just coincidentally happens to be just north of the boundary lines of Greater Israel, encompassing a chunk of Turkey, of course, which is rather strange, I'm sure, to some people. You know, that we're backing forces that are ideologically opposed to a NATO ally, which is also itself falling into Islamofascism and beginning to get attacked by ISIS and beginning to have sort of societal problems there as well. Turkey could destabilize at any time. I've warned people that I've talked to, happen to be from Turkey. Turkey's fucked. Turkey's absolutely fucked. You don't just have the refugees and ISIS, you also have the Kurds to deal with, these sort of Syrian groups. Assad's no friend, the Iranians, Russia's now involved in Syria. What the fuck could possibly happen if the UK or the USA begins marching into Syria when the Russians are already there? You know, the Kerry goes and says, oh, well, I'm warning the Russians, they shouldn't get involved here. Why would they warn the Russians about trying to restore order in Syria? If all the Western governments want, here's the final point. If they want to restore order to protect the civilians of Syria, why would they have a problem with Russia getting involved in doing just that? Here's the secret. It's because the Russians back Assad. They want a central stable authority back under Assad, who happens to be a Russian pawn. They don't want the so-called moderate rebels in Syria to be the ones in charge. The Western governments would not tell Russia to fuck off unless they themselves wanted to get physically involved on the ground in Syria to prop up these rebels and get rid of Assad. And that's exactly what they want to do. This is why Putin marched some men into there, to try to prevent the West from marching in, which probably will preserve Syria. If we do get involved, you could have a situation where, much like the Yugoslavian conflicts of the past, the sort of Kosovo crisis, with the Serbs and so forth, where we almost fired upon an airport full of Russian soldiers, thus starting World War III, you could have a situation like that, where some lowly field commander gives the wrong order and everybody gets fucked. So keep that in mind before you support any war, and before you support taking in any of these refugees that will then start a mass exodus from areas where they're already temporarily sheltered. They'll leave Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon and these places and start moving into Europe even more. Before you support that, think good, long, and hard about what happens if we really end up getting involved in this nation. That's about all. Peace out.